Welcome to this week's edition of Flashback Friday, your opportunity to get some good review by listening to episodes from the past that Jason has handpicked to help you today in the present and propel you into the future. Enjoy.
This show is produced by the Hartman Media Company. For more information and links to all our great podcasts, visit hartmanmedia.com.
Speakers, publishers, consultants, coaches, and info marketers unite. The Speaking of Wealth Show is your roadmap to success and significance. Learn the latest tools, technologies, and tactics to get more bookings, sell more products, and attract more clients. If you're looking to increase your direct response sales, create a big-time personal brand, and become the go-to guru, the Speaking of Wealth Show is for you. Here is your host, Jason Hartman.
Welcome to the Speaking of Wealth Show. This is your host, Jason Hartman, where we discuss profit strategies for speakers, publishers, authors, consultants, coaches, info marketers, and just go over a whole bunch of exciting things that you can use to increase your business, to make your business more successful and more passive and more automated and more scalable. So we will be back with a great interview. Be sure to visit us at speakingofwealth.com. You can take advantage of our blog, subscribe to the RSS feed, and many other resources for free at speakingofwealth.com. And we will be back with a great interview for you in less than 60 seconds.
What's great about the shows you'll find on jasonhartman.com is that if you want to learn how to finance your next big real estate deal, there's a show for that. If you want to learn more about food storage and the best way to keep those onions from smelling up everything else, there's a show for that. If you honestly want to know more about business ethics, there's a show for that. And if you just want to get away from it all and need to know something about world travel, there's even a show for that. Yep, there's a show for just about anything. Only from jasonhartman.com. Or type in Jason Hartman in the iTunes store.
It's my pleasure to welcome Chris Guillebeau to the show. He is author of 3 great books. I recently saw him speak at Awesomeness Fest in Puerto Vallarta on the happiness of pursuit, finding the quest that will bring purpose to your life. But he's also author of The $100 Startup and a great book on nonconformity. Chris, welcome. How are you?
I'm great, Jason. Thanks so much for having me.
Good. And you're coming to us, I assume, from Portland, Oregon today?
I am indeed, my home base. I travel quite a bit, but I'm home in Portland this week.
Well, we know you travel quite a bit because you're one of the few people, Chris, who's actually got me beat. I've been to 74 countries now, and you've been to all of them more than once on many occasions, right?
Yeah, well, I have, but that's pretty good. 74 is great. So yeah, I had a 10-year quest of going to every country in the world, so that's 193.
Wow.
And it just wrapped up last year.
And then you've been back to some for multiple visits, I guess?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I didn't pursue the quest just for the sake of the quest. You know, like yourself, I love travel, and I just love being out in the world, and I have a great community all over the world now. And so, yeah, many of those places I've been to more than once, as I'm sure you have too.
Where should we start with your work? You've got a pretty broad, kind of different kinds of work. I'd love to talk about the $100 Startup maybe as the start, if that's okay with you.
No, that's great. So, as you briefly mentioned, I had a book before that called The Art of Nonconformity. And, during that process, I went on a 50-state book tour. I also went to every province in Canada. And I kept meeting all these really interesting people. And I connected with a lot of different entrepreneurs and solopreneurs and people who didn't even necessarily consider themselves an entrepreneur, with a capital E, but they had created a freedom project for themselves. They had created a lifestyle business, usually focused on something that they were skillful in or some kind of passion they had that they were able to turn into a small business. And so with $100 Startup, the goal there was to share these stories and to share these collective stories of how all these people have done it. Not just my story, like I've been an entrepreneur my whole life, but not just my story, but other people, who didn't go to business school, who didn't write an 80-page business plan, who didn't do the traditional startup, angel investing, going to a bank or to investors to borrow money. Like they just kind of found a way to succeed on their own. So I wanted to show people exactly how that was done.
Yeah. So it is really amazing to me how the cost of starting a business has just plummeted in recent years. And this has really democratized the playing field. Everybody should have, regardless of what they do, but, I'm especially speaking to employees out here, they should have a $100 startup on the side. I mean, if nothing else, then for tax benefits,
Yeah, well, I think also for the benefit of empowerment and the benefit of earning your income from different sources. I think it's very freedom oriented. It's very like empowering to say, okay, I have this thing that I do, and maybe I still have a paycheck. Maybe I still have that because I need these benefits or whatever, and that's fine. But I've got this other thing that I also do, and maybe I only spend a couple of hours a week on it or something. But it's really just a fun process, to begin signing your first client or making your first sale or putting up your first website, even if it's super basic, even if it just has a PayPal button on it. So I'm certainly an advocate for helping people, create something for themselves that's meaningful and that brings greater freedom and independence to their lives.
Yeah, no question. Income diversification is a nice thing to have, and there are many stories, and I'm sure you've tracked some of them, of someone who had their paycheck from their corporate job, and wouldn't you know it, the Grim Reaper came, they got the layoff, and then they thought, I got this little passionate thing on the side that I tinker with. I'm going to turn it into something big now.
Yeah,
absolutely. And that's that happens all the time.
And what some of these people say sometimes, it's really interesting because there's a lot of common language that they use. And when those people are laid off, they talk about how it's a shock and it is something that's initially perceived as negative, but then they kind of realize like this was actually the greatest thing that ever happened to me, because it led me into something, totally different. As you said, it led me to pursue that passion project, maybe in, full-time or at least more part-time. It led me to really kind of go off into a new way. So often these, bad things that happen to us, they can be a catalyst for a whole transformation.
Mm-hmm. So let's kind of drill down and get at the core of the $100 startup. I mean, what is it all about? What's the core philosophy? You talk about the roaming entrepreneur and, that Tim Ferriss has certainly talked a lot about, being geographically independent and that's really, there's a revolution going on out there of people who live this life.
Yes.
And, it provides a lot of freedom, but I'm sure there's a lot more to it.
Well, I think, being geographically independent is a wonderful thing. And it also doesn't mean necessarily that you have to travel all the time, because some people aren't into that. Like I've been a traveler like much of my life. I know you have as well. Not everyone wants to, be in a different country every week or something. But for me, the greatest part about it is the freedom. It's the ability. It's like, okay, well, maybe I'm not, leaving home next week, but I could, if I wanted. So $100 Startup is essentially about helping people to transform their skills. It's helping people to kind of understand like, okay, here are all your skills, and maybe you didn't realize that there was this one thing that you're good at. And if you're good at something, you're probably good at something else. And there's probably some connection between those things that can be turned into a viable business. And so what we tried to do with $100 Startup was, to provide all these different case studies and showing how people had found convergence between what they love to do or what they're skilled at, what the questions that people ask them all the time, and what other people also value. And that is the key distinction. It's essentially like saying, okay, there's this guy in Virginia that I like to talk about. He did have a full-time job, and he was always passionate about travel, just like you and I were. And he was really passionate about frequent flyer miles, and he always helped people, to travel, in first class and business class using their miles. And he did that for free. And finally, people said, why don't you do this as a service? And he thought, well, no one's ever going to, pay for this. This is something you could do on your own for free. But people did pay for it. He set up a very basic website, just had a little PayPal button there. And within a year, he was making a six-figure income, from this side project. So he had found convergence between this thing that he loved to do that was totally normal and natural to him, but was kind of confusing to other people. Like other people didn't know how to use the miles. So he helped them do that, that it totally took off. He actually stayed in the job for a long period of time. He talked about how he liked going to work. It was a different kind of environment. He liked his colleagues, but on the side, he was building this business, that again was very empowering and great to have that different source of revenue and great to have that savings. So basically it's about helping people say, okay, here's all the things that I'm into and here's how I can transform that into something that's not just my hobby or my passion, but something that's valuable and interesting to other people that they will then pay for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, good. So that is an amazing story because as you're traveling, you're just going to figure out the system, hopefully, and then the example you gave is someone who shares it and built a great business out of it. We've heard of the websites like the Miles Guy and all of that. So yeah, good stuff. Okay, what other core things should people know about the $100 Startup?
A big part of it was, you mentioned Lean Startup when we were just chatting before the show, and Lean Startup is a wonderful book. I like Eric a lot. That book is much more focused on organizations, and $100 Startup is much more focused on individuals. So it's not that one is better or worse, and that I think they complement each other well. But I guess I'm more interested in focusing on helping people who they're not trying to start this huge business necessarily. They're not trying to create this organization, or they're not trying to make the next iPhone. They're trying to do what they love, and they're trying to do something that supports their other goals, whether it's world travel, whether it's just more time with their family. There's lots of stories of people who had families and their project allowed them, to spend more time or to travel together as a family or to pursue something that was meaningful to them. So I guess I'm much more interested in looking at people's whole lives and saying, okay, what are we working toward? And what are the best goals or the best means of achieving that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So really, it's about freedom and choice and passion, and that's a great thing. Okay, good. Nonconformity. That's an interesting topic. And why did you write that book? I mean, what was the thing about it? Were you in the position where you were told, like so many people, go get a regular day job and do this thing and just have this traditional life? And you really, you definitely broke that mold.
Well, Jason, I wasn't ever good at having a traditional job. Like, I was a terrible employee. And that was, some of the initial motivation for being an entrepreneur was like, I just do not want to work for someone else. I want to create something of my own. And maybe it's not even that great at first, but even if it's not that great, I'm going to value that more than I am, trying to succeed according to someone else's life and someone else's rules and their expectations. And so the central theme of The Art of Nonconformity, both the book and my blog, is that you don't have to live your life the way other people expect. And you can do good things for yourself and for others at the same time. It's not a false choice. It's not a dichotomy. It's not like you're totally, selfish and self-serving if you pursue a dream. I think if you have a dream, it's something that's meaningful to you, then you should go after it. Like my dream of going to every country in the world. But I also think, as part of that, I think because we have so much freedom, because we have so many opportunities, I think that each of us kind of yearns to answer this question about contribution, this question of like, how can we serve others? How can we best connect with others? Like we all have a limited time on earth. How can we do something that we really enjoy that also makes the world a better place? And so when I started the blog, my goal was to kind of highlight, some of these ideas and these ideals and to say like, here's how different people all over the world from different backgrounds are all answering these questions. They're all answering this question of how do we live a remarkable life in a conventional world? And as you said, like we have like these days, the cost of starting a business, is so much lower. And we know a lot of people who are working in a freelancing economy. They're kind of doing their own thing. And this was not super common, 15 years ago. Like when I started working online, like there were other people doing it, but I didn't know a lot of them. It wasn't just like in my community. There were all kinds of people like working at the coffee shop on their own projects or whatever. Like the global commerce of the internet was still developing. So now it's like this great age, right? It's this great, opportunity, possibility. So much is out there. And I just wanted to kind of be an amplifier for that. So I don't see myself as a catalyst. It's not like I'm saying like, oh, I started this thing. No, I think like this thing has already started. It was a revolution, to use your word. But I wanted to kind of come along and say like, let's amplify this. Let's share this. There's a lot of people who live in small towns, or maybe they live in places, that aren't necessarily seen as creative hubs, lots of nonconformists or whatever. And I wanted to reach them. I wanted to say like, hey, it doesn't really matter where you're living. Like there's other people who see the world in the same way, and come be a part of this, come be a part of this revolution, this social movement, this great change in society.
Yeah, and it really is an amazing revolution. How do you compare grad school to the blogosphere?
I wrote a chapter in that book a few years ago about my experience in graduate school. I spent 2 years doing a master's degree in international studies, and it wasn't a terrible experience. Like, I don't really regret it, but I guess I also kind of saw it as somewhat marginal value compared to the value that I experienced and gained as I began sharing my work online. And I did this whole comparison chart of the master's thesis that I wrote. And so I spent, 6 months writing this master's thesis about governance in Liberia. And, at the end of the day, probably 3 people read it. Like my committee, my thesis committee, and presumably they read it. Maybe they just kind of skimmed it. Who knows? But then, around the same time, I was starting my blog, and I wrote this manifesto called A Brief Guide to World Domination. And that was just about worldview and ideas and how people can change the world. I published that for free. And within about 6 months, 100,000 people had downloaded it, and I get all these nice emails and hear people's stories of how they're applying these concepts in their own way and how it maybe helped them in some fashion. And I'm like, wow, 3 people, and they were good people. Like, I enjoyed, studying governance in Liberia, but the impact is so small, compared to being able to share something online and to have people download it and engage with it. So that's why I was like, I'm going to go full in to this blogosphere thing. I'm going to fully invest in building my community and doing whatever I can to serve them, because there's so much more potential here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Did you have, when you were doing this and you were doing your travels and kind of modeling your own business, did you have any regrets? I mean, you must have been fearful. I regret
that I didn't start sooner.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
because,
fair. Yeah.
I actually had kind of stood on the sidelines, for a few years and saw all these people starting these blogs, and they were getting super popular, or podcasts or video series or whatever. And I felt like I was too late. I was like, man, if only I'd started like 3 years before, or been on the forefront, and I feel like it's really important to highlight this, because a lot of people think they have to have this first mover advantage. They have to be an early adopter of some kind of technology or platform or whatever the latest social network is. And I really feel that's irrelevant, and it's not critical to your success. What's critical to your success is creating something that matters and creating something that's meaningful, that's going to help people's lives. And then the second part is connecting with those people. If you focus on those 2 things, I really feel like everything else is fine. So I regret not starting sooner, because I always wanted to be a writer, but for whatever reason, I didn't really start sharing anything online until I was 30. And maybe it was better in some ways because it could be more refined or something, but I don't know. I think that's probably an excuse. So anybody who's listening should not hesitate to start their project or to make progress on their project.
Yeah, well, interestingly, too, when you talk about the first mover advantage, I mean, there are countless stories of, number one, how people are attracted to that, like the shiny object. But in the bigger corporate world, lots of examples of how the first movers never usually become the dominators.
Exactly.
And it's always like the second movers. And there's an old saying, how do you know who the pioneers are? Well, they're the people with the arrows in their back. And
that's good.
I mean, look at the difference between MySpace and Facebook, for example, right? And that first mover, they really do a lot of the heavy lifting. So it's, people will always feel that, like, why didn't they start sooner, or now they're behind, or the space is really crowded now. But just start something, and you give it some differentiation, and you're passionate about it, you'll be fine. Good thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, I like this quote: "The best time to start was last year." Mm-hmm. But failing that, today will do.
Yeah, right. The second best time is now.
Right.
Great quote. Yeah, really good. So I cannot believe that no one has exploited the great title of your most recent book, which I was fortunate to get autographed by you when we met, and that's The Happiness of Pursuit. Awesome play on words. Tell us about that. I mean, Is it really the concept of being in the moment, and how the pursuit, the Cervantes quote, the journey is better than the end? Tell us more.
It's not so much about being in the moment. It's more about building towards something in the long term. A quest is not something that happens in a moment. A quest by its nature is challenging and difficult, and it can't be too easy. In fact, that's what we like the best about it. We like the challenge. We like working towards something over time. And so the whole concept of happiness at pursuit is it's the collective story of all kinds of people who've undertaken quests. So it has my story of going to every country in the world, but then it has lots of other stories. There's, this guy from Canada who took on the 4-year MIT computer science curriculum in a single year. It was like, I'm going to just totally accelerate this, and I'm going to post my exams online, a fully transparent process. That was his quest. There was another guy who walked across America. There was a young woman who is a mother, and she decided to cook a meal from every country in the world. So she had this culinary quest. There was a family that cycled from Alaska to Argentina. So it's all these different stories of how these people did it. So they're all real life stories. They're not mythology. It's like things that real people have done. And what are the lessons of that? What can we learn from that? How can we apply this to our own lives? And in my life, I found that having the quest brought a lot of happiness and purpose. And it even connected a lot to my entrepreneurial career, which is something I didn't really realize in the beginning because it was just a personal dream. It was something that I did because I like to travel. And once I had this crazy idea of going to every country, I just couldn't get it out of my head. I knew I had to say yes. And you mentioned regret earlier. Like I knew I would regret it if I didn't do it. So I wanted to just kind of crystallize all these lessons and then put forward this agenda to the reader. And the agenda is that adventure is good for us. Mm-hmm. And we should do hard things. We should pursue a quest. We should adopt adventure as a value in our lives. And here's how we can do it.
Mm-hmm. So how can we do it? How can we make that a value? And if you want to share just before we wrap up here, one or two of those lessons that some of those very interesting people you profile learned. I mean, it's quite fascinating, But like, what came out of it? So you cook a meal from every country in the world. I mean, that's quite fascinating. 193 different meals.
Well, so the thing is, right? You cook a meal from every country in the world. Like you could have just said, I'm going to make a bunch of different foreign food. I'm going to make Indian food this week, right? But the difference is, like, you have the quest, you have this something specific, you have these parameters and this packaging for it, and there's a challenge and there's milestones along the way, like you can see as you're going, and so you can see, like, here's how far we've come and here's how far we have to go. There's a lot of value in that, and a lot of people that I talked to, when they began their quest, they were kind of discontented. They were a little bit unsettled, and I don't mean that they were all miserable, but they all had this kind of yearning for something more. And they found that, through responding to the call of adventure. And if you don't know what that is, well, you start experimenting. You start doing something different. You start disrupting your routine. You ask yourself, like, what am I excited about? And not just what am I excited about, what am I bothered by? Like, what troubles me about the world, and how am I going to do something about that? And that's a great question to ask if you're trying to start a business. And it's also a great question to ask if you're trying to figure out your life. And as you kind of explore those things and go down those roads, I think your vision tends to expand as you do that. And maybe in the beginning, like, you didn't have this crazy idea of doing something that seems really big, but you had something that was big for you at the time. And then as you do it, like, the vision will grow and your confidence will increase as well.
Yeah, very, very good advice. And that is a great question to ask when starting a business, a movement, or an adventure. So awesome. Good stuff there. Chris, give out your websites and tell people where they can read your blog and so forth.
Awesome. Well, my website is chrisguillebeau.com, which no one can ever spell. But if you type in artofnonconformity.com, that will also bring you to me.
Okay, good stuff. And just a final question for you. We alluded to it before a little bit about just starting, and the second best time to start is today, obviously. If someone hasn't started doing what they want, or writing or traveling or whatever it might be. But, what advice would you have to any aspiring authors who, maybe they're just starting, or they've got a small following already, maybe they've got a little blog or a little social media following. What advice would you have to them?
My advice would be to start where you are, and to start with an idea and start with something to say. I feel like that's by far the most important thing. There is no blog fairy, that descends and, like, all of a sudden you have this readership. Like, everyone starts, at the same level. But if you really focus on, like, making something meaningful and building this connection with your readers, and then as part of that, issue a challenge, issue an invitation. I think people like to be challenged. They like to hear, like, this is not just my blog about, life and travel, but it's actually like I'm presenting this agenda. And here's what it is, and here's the mission statement. And if you're reading this and you like this, then join us, because we need you. I think that goes a long way. And everything else is just a process of continuing to develop, and coming up with an idea and building the platform every day. That's what most of us do in different ways. So just stick with it.
Yeah, good points. Well, Chris, thank you so much for joining us. All 3 books are on Amazon with fantastic and many, many reviews. So keep up the good work. And what's next for you?
Oh, I'm still traveling, still writing books. We produce different events and things. I feel very fortunate to be able to do what I do every day. So I try to be grateful.
Yeah, good stuff. Well, keep up the good work. Chris Guillebeau, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Jason.
This show is produced by the Hartman Media Company, all rights reserved. For distribution or publication rights and media interviews, please visit www.hartmanmedia.com or email media@hartmanmedia.com. Nothing on this show should be considered specific personal or professional advice. Please consult an appropriate tax, legal, real estate, or business professional for individualized advice. Opinions of guests are their own, and the host is acting on behalf of Platinum Properties Investor Network, Inc. exclusively.